September 1944. A liberated town near Reims, France. Rain beats against the cracked windows of an abandoned Gestapo office, where a lone American intelligence officer sifts through waterlogged filing cabinets. He pulls out a fresh, precisely typed document that makes him freeze. It is a registry of 83 local French civilians who spent 4 years serving as paid informants for the German occupation. The pages contain names, home addresses, dates of recruitment, and a ledger detailing exactly who these citizens betrayed, leading to immediate deportations and executions. Outside, local townspeople gather in the streets to celebrate their freedom, completely unaware that the names of their betrayers sit on a desk just feet away. General George S. Patton will soon receive this document, and his response will determine whether this town experiences a transition to legal justice or a bloodbath of vigilante vengeance. This is the story of what General Patton did when an intelligence officer discovered an abandoned Gestapo document detailing how dozens of local French citizens systematically betrayed their own neighbors. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the truth buried under the rubble of retreat. First Lieutenant Antoine Marchand was 28 years old and came from New Orleans, Louisiana. He served as an intelligence officer in the Third Army. Marchand grew up in a French Creole household where the language of his ancestors was spoken daily at the dinner table. This upbringing made him fluent, but it also gave him a deep affinity for the culture of France. Before the war, he worked as a high school history teacher, studying the nuances of human behavior through old letters and records. He volunteered the day after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a young wife and a quiet life. He had seen the brutal results of occupational warfare across Normandy, watching towns torn apart by suspicion and fear. His linguistic skills made him invaluable, but his historical training made him sensitive to the human cost of conflict. He was the man who found the ledger, and he knew instantly that the paper in his hands held enough explosive power to obliterate the fragile peace of the newly freed town. Jean-Luc Bureau was 51 years old and served as the chief administrative clerk for the regional occupation authorities in Reims. He wore tailored wool suits, polished leather shoes, and a golden signet ring that had been in his family for 3 generations. Bureau believed entirely in the concept of absolute social order and stability. He viewed the German occupation not as a tragedy, but as a necessary correction to the chaotic nature of modern democracy. He often remarked to his associates that ordinary people required a firm hand to keep them efficient and compliant. His position allowed him to secure extra coal, white flour, and fine wine while his neighbors rationed potato peels. He kept meticulous records because he believed his bureaucratic precision proved his superiority over the common citizens. He saw himself as a protector of civilization, even as he filed the very papers that sent 83 of his fellow countrymen to their deaths. By September 1944, the German army was retreating rapidly across northern France, leaving behind a wake of logistical chaos and abandoned headquarters. The Allied advance was moving faster than intelligence units could process, pushing through towns that had lived under the shadow of the swastika for over 4 years. In the rush to escape the encirclement of Patton's Third Army, Gestapo units burned crates of secret documents, but the sheer speed of the American armor left many offices partially intact. This rapid liberation created a dangerous vacuum of authority. Municipal governments were shattered, local police forces were compromised, and the line between survival and collaboration had blurred significantly over 48 months of starvation and terror. In many newly liberated regions, frontline combat commanders chose to ignore the messy realities of local politics, focusing entirely on pushing their tanks forward toward the German border. They left the administration of towns to self-appointed local committees, often turning a blind eye when immediate, extrajudicial violence broke out in the public squares. Shaved heads and public beatings were becoming common sights as populations vented years of humiliation. Most senior officers believed that sorting out who had helped the enemy was a task for the French national government after the war ended, not a matter for tactical units in the middle of an offensive. They filed away captured registries in rear area depots, allowing local tensions to simmer until they inevitably boiled over into the streets. But in this sector, the discovery occurred right in the path of a military commander who refused to tolerate any breakdown of civil order behind his front lines. The documents sat in the damp room, waiting for an official decision that would either ignite a civil war in the community or force it to face the systematic nature of its own betrayal. Lieutenant Marchand stared at the typed lines of the ledger, his fingers tightly gripping the edge of the wooden desk. As the local administrative clerk entered the room, Jean-Luc Bureau carried a leather briefcase, his movements unhurried and his posture completely untroubled by the presence of the American uniform. The lieutenant looked up from the pages and asked if the clerk knew what this registry contained. Bureau smiled thinly, adjusting his tailored wool jacket, and answered that it was simply a routine administrative record from the occupation period. Marchand leaned forward, pointing to a name on the top page, and noted that this record detailed exactly how 83 citizens systematically destroyed their own community for fuel and extra food rations. The clerk remained calm, stating that a proper society requires a structured mechanism for maintaining order under any authority. The lieutenant countered that these names belonged to the local baker, a schoolteacher, and the secretary to the mayor, people who willfully sent their neighbors to execution squads. He told the clerk that this was a legal matter of treason, not a routine administrative filing. Bureau dismissed the statement with a wave of his hand, replying that the common populace is inherently unstable and always requires the firm guidance of an educated administrative class to keep them productive. He added that the individuals who provided information were merely assisting in the elimination of criminal elements who threatened the stability of the region. Marchand stood up from his chair, his voice hardening, as he stated that the document would be immediately secured under military authority as primary evidence for a future war crimes tribunal. The clerk stepped closer, his voice rising in arrogance as he declared that a foreign army had no right to interfere with the internal records of a French municipal office. He stated that the local populace would never understand the necessity of these actions, and that, if the names were revealed, the subsequent chaos would prove his point about the inferiority of the common citizen. Bureau insisted that the records belonged under his personal custody to ensure that the proper social hierarchy of the town remained intact after the American forces inevitably moved on to the border. The lieutenant realized that the clerk felt completely entitled to his position and felt no remorse for the lives listed in the columns. Marchand called for a pair of military police guards, instructing them to place Bureau under immediate arrest and to seal every exit to the building. He gathered the heavy ledger, placed it into a canvas courier bag, and walked out to his vehicle to report the situation directly to the command staff. The report reached Patton within the hour. September 1944, a former Gestapo office in a liberated town near Reims, France. Rain streaks the windows of a dark room filled with overturned desks and scattered papers. An American officer shines his flashlight onto a heavy wooden table. He pulls open a locked bottom drawer and extracts a thick, neatly typed folder. Inside lies a detailed list. It contains 83 names, addresses, and code names of local French civilians who spent 4 years informing on their neighbors. Next to each name is a meticulous record of payments in food and fuel. There are also specific notes about which neighbor was arrested, deported, or executed because of their betrayal. The young officer reads the names of the local baker, the schoolteacher, and the mayor's secretary. He realizes this document will trigger an immediate bloodbath in the streets. But General Patton is already on his way to handle the discovery. September 1944. A liberated town near Reims, France. Rain falls on the shattered slate roofs and cobblestone streets. Inside an abandoned Gestapo office, dust settles over overturned desks and discarded iron keys. A young American intelligence officer sifts through a stack of water-stained folders left behind in the chaotic German retreat. He pulls a single typed ledger from the bottom of a heavy metal crate. His eyes scan the neatly aligned rows of names, addresses, and code letters. It is a meticulous roster of 83 local French civilians who secretly served as informants for the occupying forces. The document links every local betrayal to a specific arrest, deportation, or execution. The air in the room grows heavy as the officer realizes what he holds in his hands. General George S. Patton will soon receive this ledger and issue a command that alters the fate of the entire town. Antoine Marchand went home to New Orleans after the victory in Europe. He returned to his family and worked as an insurance investigator for 30 years. He married, raised 3 children, and watched the city change around him. He never spoke about the typed ledger or the rainy night in Reims to his neighbors or his friends. The only reminder he kept was a small, tarnished brass key from the Gestapo office, which sat in his desk drawer until his death in 1983. The town near Reims rebuilt its shattered roofs, but the invisible scars remained. No trials were held for the 83 individuals on the secret roster, as the classified files stayed locked within the National Judicial Archives for decades. The baker, the schoolteacher, and the secretary lived out their lives in the same neighborhoods, surrounded by the families of the people who had disappeared. Neighbors continued to buy bread, attend classes, and sign official documents, looking into the eyes of people they quietly suspected but could never openly accuse. General George S. Patton died late the following year, in December 1945, following a vehicle accident in Germany. He never recorded the incident in his personal diaries, and he never mentioned the list of informants during his later press conferences. He kept the original report filed under military intelligence records until it was transferred away from his headquarters. He told an aide a week after the incident that a commander must sometimes lock up the truth to prevent a liberated people from destroying themselves before they have a chance to heal. Some historians have argued that the decision to conceal the document was a severe compromise of justice. They claim that shielding collaborators allowed traitors to escape punishment and denied families closure. By keeping the roster secret, the military priorities overrode the local right to transparency. Others argue the opposite, defending the action as a necessary measure of social preservation. They believe that releasing 83 names into a freshly liberated community would have sparked immediate bloody chaos. Vigilante violence would have shattered the fragile town before a legitimate legal framework could be established. What is certain is that the decision prevented immediate bloodshed and transferred the burden of long-term stability directly to the local civil government. What Patton did when he found a list of 83 civilians who betrayed their neighbors to the Gestapo September 1944, a former Gestapo office in a liberated town near Reims, France. The midday sun cuts through the dust of a room abandoned in a panic. Papers litter the floor, but one heavy ledger remains intact on the oak desk. An American intelligence officer opens it, expecting to find troop movements or supply tallies. Instead, his eyes lock onto a neatly typed roster containing 83 names. It is a local informant list, complete with home addresses, financial compensation records, and specific names of neighbors sent to the execution walls. The air in the room suddenly turns ice cold. If these names reach the public street outside, a wave of bloody vigilante executions will tear the community apart before the sun sets. General George S. Patton will decide exactly how these 83 traitors face their final reckoning.